Hello. Today I want to talk about how the Bible was created, which includes talking about how the original traditions were transmitted, then how they were put together, they were assembled and then included in these longer collections that eventually formed the Bible. We should first say that there are no original texts by any of the biblical authors. In other words, we don't have the original writings, the documents that may have been produced by the writers themselves. So we don't have the autograph written by Isaiah. We don't have the very writing of Ezekiel. We don't have the very writing of Haggai. What we have is copies. This very often surprises people that begin to study the Bible. We have, yes, to be sure, thousands of copies, but we don't have the very writing produced by one of those biblical authors. For that matter, we don't have the original writing of a letter written by Paul. What we have is copies. By the way, the original writings are referred to as autographs. Auto from self and graph from writing. So what we have is copies. We don't have autographs. When it comes to the copies, you may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these documents, this library that was discovered on the shores of the Dead Sea starting in 1947. They were not all discovered at the same time, but that's when the first discovery was made of ancient Hebrew, Aramaic manuscripts that had been left there by a community that had existed there for at least 200 years. And when the first Jewish revolt began in the year 66 of the Common Era, the people that lived in Qumran, which is the name that is given to that community, hid their library, and that is then what we refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars relied on the medieval Jewish manuscripts for the Hebrew Bible, known as the Masoretic Text, and we shall talk about that in a second, what that is. The Bible we have today has gone through a number of translations. When it comes to the Old Testament, we speak of Hebrew and Aramaic. Then those books that were written in Hebrew and Aramaic were translated eventually into Greek. Then they were translated into Latin, and then ultimately translated into English, which is the language that most of you probably are familiar with. So the Bible was not written originally in English. It was not written originally in the King James version of English from the 17th century. Let's talk about the transmission of the biblical text, how they originated. Think about a book like Isaiah that has 66 chapters and covers a very wide span of several hundred years. Of course, it is impossible that one individual would have written this book, because the issues, the events that the book is concerned with covers hundreds of years, at least 3 centuries perhaps more. So what we have is in books such as Isaiah, books such as Jeremiah, the collection of Psalms, is that these books were written over very extended periods of time, probably by many hands that collected these traditions, and the traditions grew. Imagine here a snowball that begins very little, and as it's moving down a slope is growing and growing and growing until by the time it hits the bottom of the mountain, it has grown considerably from what it used to be when it first started. Biblical texts were like that. They began perhaps by being assembled, very small collections of sayings that eventually grew. And here we can say then that it is likely that they originated in oral form. So when it comes, for instance, to a book like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, these were speeches that were delivered orally, and then individuals began collecting these things and writing them down. As a matter of fact, the book of Jeremiah itself tells us that Jeremiah dictated his oracles to an assistant, to a scribe by the name of Baruch. And then the traditions were eventually written down by ancient Israelite scribes into the form, the shape that we are used to seeing. It is important to point out, though, that of the many biblical manuscripts that we have, not two are identical. They are very similar, but they are not identical. And what we find then is considerable variation among the manuscripts. Let's talk about the Masoretic Text. The Masoretic Text, or the MT, you will see that in the secondary literature, in the scholarly literature, is a text on which most contemporary translations of the Old Testament are based. The label, the name, derives from the word Masora, which means transmission. And this Masora and the Masoretic Text refers to a school of medieval Jewish scholars. When I say school, I mean gatherings of rabbis that spend their days and their nights working on the Hebrew Bible, preserving it, copying it, creating mechanisms that assure that when the text was written down, it would be written down and copied with as few errors as possible. And these individuals we know as the Masoretes. The Masoretes worked for decades, for many decades, between the 9th and the 10th centuries. And we have, at least in the modern world, two instances of the Masoretic Text are well known: the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. Most translations of the Old Testament that you may see are made from a copy of the Leningrad Codex, which is, of course, a Masoretic text preserved and kept today in Russia. Let's talk about Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves around the shores of the Dead Sea. And the discoveries began around 1947. And as I said in the previous slide, they lasted several years. It was not, it did not all happen at the same time. The scrolls were copied between the year 250 BCE to 66, 67 of the Common Era, And they are important because they are at least 1,000 years older than the Masoretic Text. And in this enterprise of biblical transmission, we scholars prefer older. So when you're going to graduate school, you hear your professors say that when it comes to the Bible, older is better. That is as far as the transmission of the biblical text, not necessarily the translations. There are very decent translations that are contemporary, that are modern. And we will talk about the issue of translation and the need for constant translation in a later presentation. The Dead Sea Scrolls are important because they are perhaps one of the most important witnesses to the Hebrew Bible available today. I use the word witness when we are referring to manuscripts. We refer to the different collections, to the different manuscripts that do exist as witnesses. That is actually a technical term. The canon of the Hebrew Bible refers to the collection that is in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. It grew by slow degrees rather than rapidly. I tell my students often that the Bible didn't fall down from heaven in a nice box with a red ribbon around, but rather it grew, and it grew over several centuries, probably beginning with the return of Judean exiles from Babylon in the year 538, and the destruction of Judea by the Romans in the year 70. So, in other words, what we have here is a process that lasted several centuries, and it happened by stages. The Pentateuch, or the first 5 books in the Old Testament, was probably the first collection to be assembled and to receive this status of scripture among religious Jews. And other parts of the Hebrew Bible then slowly is the key word here, began to be accepted, began to be assembled, gathered together, so that they also became eventually scripture. The same can be said for the canon of the New Testament. It took place over hundreds of years. The books that comprise the New Testament appear to be written between the year 50 of the Common Era and the middle of the 2nd century. However, the process was not complete until the closing of the 4th century. A complete list of the 27 books that we now have in the New Testament is given in a letter of a bishop named Athanasius, who actually lists the 27 books as they now appear in the New Testament for the first time. It is key here to notice that the process was one of exclusion rather than inclusion. It works like this. It was decided what books would not belong more than what books would be included. We know, of course, that early Christians read widely and read a variety of things that are not now in the New Testament. Let's talk about Marcion. Marcion was a Christian who was influenced by Gnostic ideas, and it's likely that his actions may have led some Christians to say, okay, we need to start assembling some texts. These are the texts that we will accept, that we will read. And that is because he was the first one to come up with a list. His list included a version of the Gospel of Luke and some of Paul's writings. You may read some more about this in the book. The Vulgate refers to a translation done by Jerome in the 4th century, translated from the original languages into Latin. And it continues to be the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church.